And Minister, I'm glad to take this opportunity to discuss this bill to strengthen the State's ability to manage stocks in the event of a curtailment of oil supplies. And I've listened, Minister, to your assurances that no such shortage is imminent, and indeed I agree it's important that debates in here on energy security do not give rise to any sense of panic. But it is inevitable that at some stage fossil fuels will no longer be available to us to further exploit. And indeed, it's also clearly in the context of the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia that we're having this debate. And I think that has made us all particularly and acutely aware about the risks to our energy security and our fuel security. So it's both in the context of the climate catastrophe and in the context of that brutal war that we are having this debate. So with that in mind, I do look forward to further engaging with you on the bill and on other measures to make more durable the various sectors of everyday life which are most vulnerable to fluctuations in the supply of fossil fuels and indeed most vulnerable to energy insecurity. So the bill offers some welcome clarity around the powers of the Minister and how quickly they can be deployed to control the supply and distribution of fuel in an emergency situation. And the bill will also put all aspects of oil emergency planning on a statutory footing and will establish a register of oil suppliers to ensure fast communication to retailers. And that's positive. I think we're all conscious that as part of our EU and international energy agency obligations, the National Oil Reserves Agency maintains approximately 85 days of strategic stocks. That stock holding is expected to be at 90 days, I understand, by the end of this month. And without adequate contingency plans, that's simply not a long enough time. It's all well and good to protect and preserve fossil fuels for emergency use, but of course our real priority must be, first of all, reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, but also, in the interim, insulating people from market-driven volatility on international wholesale energy markets. And in that regard, we in Labour have previously raised with you, Minister, the prospect of the government engaging in a temporary nationalisation of the Corrib gas field. And again, I would renew my call upon you and your government colleagues to give that serious consideration. It doesn't require any additional legislation, so it's a matter that doesn't need to be dealt with within this legislation, because we know that legislation is already in place from the 1970s giving government that power. And we believe that temporary nationalisation of Corrib would and should form part of any contingency plan to mitigate supply line disruptions. So it would mitigate supply line disruptions by providing a healthy supply and a guarantee of supply and, crucially, allowing for price control. And I've spoken before about the anomaly that gas produced locally in the Corrib gas field is still subject to price determination by reference to international markets. And so as a result, we see the owners of Corrib gaining really what we might describe as windfall profits, because clearly for them the cost of production has not increased. It hasn't been affected directly by the war in Ukraine, and yet they're benefiting from the international setting of prices in this way. Of course, we absolutely appreciate that the best contingency plan to mitigate supply lines of imported fuel being interrupted is to develop our own indigenous clean energy sources. And again, we believe that much more should be done by government on that. And this bill and the context of the war should not be allowed to distract from the much more pressing need to realise our potential as a world leader in clean energy production. We need here in Ireland to rapidly accelerate our efforts towards deployment of onshore wind, offshore wind and solar capacity. And I know the government have ambitions to do that, but we need to see delivery on that. We need to see really serious investment in energy efficiency and in the development of renewable capacity. We need to see an expanding interconnection with European energy suppliers and deepening internal market integration. And we need to break the hold of fossil fuel oligarchs and magnates to make Ireland the renewable superpower that I know you think, Minister, we can be, and I know we all want to be, but we need to see greater sense of urgency in the delivery of that objective. Of course, one of the most versatile ways to avoid chaos in the transport sector in the event of an oil crisis is to make more accessible the options of walking, cycling and indeed travelling in electric vehicles or vehicles powered by green hydrogen. And I know we discussed this to some extent earlier in the debate on the Climate Action Plan. I think we're all conscious of the embeddedness of oil and other fossil fuels within transport. And I think, Minister, you pointed out that transport is one of the most difficult sectors in which to achieve reductions in emissions. We know how heavily dependent Ireland is on imported fossil fuels for transport, as well as for energy generation and for heating, about 80% at present. So, that's, again, a very chilling context within which we have this debate. So part of the plan to create durable systems to withstand inevitable difficulties with oil supply must involve key transitions to modes of transport not vulnerable to shortages. And again, I did welcome the report this morning of the new EV charging measures to remove so-called range anxiety, or at least reduce it, and to encourage more people to make the shift from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles. And I was very glad in that context to read in the Climate Action Plan what was set out as part of the Avoid, Shift, Improve framework. Welcome measures there include the setting of a target of a 50% increase in daily active travel journeys and a 130% increase in daily public transport journeys. And also welcome are the improved targets, which set percentage shares for low fossil public and private vehicles, including the goal that 100% of new car registrations should be EVs. And I know we've seen impressive increases in the take-up of EVs, but we're still not coming close to the target set by government. And again, delivery is key on this issue. And at a local level, my own constituency, also your constituency, Minister, I hear every week from constituents who want to make the move to EVs, but who do not have a driveway, do not have any accessible charging point which they can use to ensure that they will have that they'll be able to use their EV. So I do want to reiterate my call for better provision for EV charging, not just on motorway networks as you've outlined today, but also for charging on streets where houses don't have driveways, where you have apartment blocks, where people do not have access currently to any public or private charging point, and which is therefore preventing the lack of such charging points, currently preventing people making a necessary move to electric vehicles. So it would be positive to see greater movement on it this year. I should say I've engaged closely with Dublin City Council on this, and I'm told that they're still, they're constantly telling me that there's new strategies being rolled out, but again, we're just not seeing delivery. So in the Portobello area, there's one public charging point, and it's always in use. And this is an area I live in where no house has a driveway, and so but many people who need cars want to make a move to EVs. And they're prevented from doing so, or at least discouraged from doing so, I should say, because of the lack of charging facilities. Looking at public transport, certainly again we see lofty goals in the Climate Action Plan, including the goal of progress on continuing the programmes of work, advancing bus connects in 5 cities, Metrolink of course, DART Plus, Cork Area Commuter Rail Programme, PSO electric bus fleet procurement, including depot charging upgrades and investment in passenger freight rail. So these are flagship infrastructure projects. We in Labour are glad to see progress being made on these, and we emphasise the potential for climate action and the transport revolution to raise standards of living in Ireland by creating new, well-paid, unionised jobs in sectors, thus providing for that all-important just transition that we speak about as the party of the left, as the party of the trade union movement. And we reiterate our call for widening of access to public transport, the introduction of a €9 climate ticket to incentivise greater use of public transport across towns and cities, across all our communities. And we believe that initiative should have been undertaken by government in the last budget in order to encourage greater usage of public transport and indeed to address the cost of living crisis by reducing public transport fares and transport costs for many families and households. But there are other smaller changes required to support all of those who wish to make that shift to public transport. And again, in our own local constituency, our local councillors, Dermot Lacey, Kevin Donoghue, and in particular Mary Freehill, have been working on small but significant ways to make public transport more accessible. Mary Freehill's work with the Age-Friendly Working Group in the Kimmage Rathmines area, for example, seeking to make bus stops more accessible. It may sound like a small thing, but I raised this at meetings with local residents, and I find this is really something that particularly older people in the community find a real hindrance to using buses. Many bus stops in Dublin lack seating. It's just a simple bus pole, and there's often no shelter, there's often no seating. For those who can, and this can be a real disincentive for people who want to use public transport, but who are very put off by the prospect of having to, or who have mobility issues and cannot stand for long periods at a bus stop. So for those who can avail of, who find it very difficult to avail of such facilities by reason of age or disability, it's a real disincentive to using buses. I should say, Councillor Freehill, having investigated the matter, learned that the primary obstacle for the NTA in installing seating at bus stops, a simple request she made, is a refusal to cede space by users of the advertising panels at bus stops. That the company which runs the advertising believes that putting seating in, even where you have panels and there is a facility to do so, that this would diminish the scope for advertising. So in addition to electronic advertisements being a very problematic addition to the public landscape, the fact that they would take precedence over access for ordinary citizens shows the need for a readjustment of priorities. And Minister, again, I would appeal to you to address this point. As a cyclist, it would be remiss of me to omit from my contribution the awesome power of cycling as a tool in the fight against energy insecurity and climate change. And I'm really glad to see some very promising bicycle infrastructure programmes starting to come on stream. Very promising, for example, to see Dublin City Council now rolling out such an extensive a network of cycle lanes across the city. That's really welcome and long overdue. We in Labour have long called for the extension of the bike to work tax scheme to allow parents to purchase bikes for their children. We've called this a bike to school scheme, which we have costed at 1.4 million and which would, we believe, really have a significant impact in encouraging uptake of cycling among children and younger people. The problem is the current tax scheme does not support those out of work or those who are self-employed to purchase a bike at present, nor does it offer supports for parents to buy bikes for their children. So we would allocate additional funding through the social welfare allowance additional needs payment to support grants of up to €250 to support those who want to buy a bike and who aren't covered by the bike to work scheme at present. Alongside this, Minister, we're calling for government to carry out a comprehensive review of how the tax system could be better used to incentivise uptake of cycling, of e-bikes and of cargo bikes, both by homes and indeed by businesses. And I know that Bike to Work has been a huge success, but it's how we can expand that and expand the take-up that is the question. And I hope you'll take these suggestions on board in the spirit of constructive engagement. Finally, Minister, as we're discussing the volatility of the energy market and the effects of external factors, in particular the war in Ukraine, I do want to take the opportunity, with the Lasca and Corless permission, to express my sympathy to those killed this morning in the attack near Kiev in Ukraine. I think it's been just another appalling loss of life, and we've seen so much loss of life over the course of the months since the war commenced, since Vladimir Putin commenced his brutal invasion. This brutal invasion is an affront to our values of democracy, of justice, of respect for life. And while it's our friends in Ukraine and neighbouring countries who are suffering the worst consequences of Putin's awful invasion, it's also a reminder of how vulnerable our way of life is to the whims of despots and of warmongers. And when we debate bills such as this, it bears repeating why we're debating them and what the context is. And climate change and conflict around the world are strongly interlinked. So the protection of our fuel systems, the protection of our fuel security here in Ireland, our energy security, that relates closely to the protection of our peace, our democratic values too, and none of that should be taken for granted. Part of our resistance to dictators like Putin must involve showing that we're serious about building our resilience so that Ireland, but all European countries, all democratic countries, will not be held to ransom by those who seek to meddle with and interfere with our energy supply, or indeed to interfere at a much more substantial level with our country, with our way of life, as we've seen in Ukraine. And I look forward to further engaging with you and your department on this bill. But again, just to reiterate that the context in which we're debating this bill is a context which I think a year ago none of us could have envisaged. We all had thought that it wouldn't happen, and now we're 10 months, 11 months into a brutal war, and of course it's raising all of these questions about fuel security, but more fundamentally about the security of all of our countries, about peace in Europe as well. So I think it's in that very serious, very depressing context that we debate this bill, which as I say we'll certainly support, because we see the need for it, without wanting to raise any panic, that it is important that contingencies are made. But we would appeal to you, Minister, to look at other contingencies too, like the nationalisation of Corrib, and of course like those vitally important climate action plan measures around transport, around so many other ways in which we can reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. Gurmaga.